I will also talk about the framework of the different sources of growth and development, which help, I think, relate bits and pieces of what we may be familiar with, like education, like investment, like knowledge flows, into a broader perspective. And then, that's too much. And then the second half of the lecture will be specifically more on technology and how policy can increase absorptive capacity. If time is sufficient, I might spend a few words discussing this new concept, or fairly new concept, of middle income trap and what can be done to escape it. That's because I definitely think this will apply to some of the economies in the area. As I have too much to say, I always start with the last slide, which summarizes it all. And here, in a number of bullets, you have a kind of a summary of what we would like to do. First, I want to talk about the technology race, and when I talk about technology race, I will primarily be talking about productivity. Why? Because productivity is a simple proxy of how we use knowledge, efficiency, capital, the broad concept of technology to augment the unskilled labor power create higher levels of productivity. It's very rough, but in the long run it works rather well. And of course, innovation and technology are immediately one of the important sources of productivity increase. The second point I want to make is that catch-up and accelerated growth is almost always related to the success in tapping into and absorbing global technology from technological leaders. It pays to not be a technological leader, because you don't have to invest everything yourself. You can absorb things, and the risks and the costs have been paid elsewhere. I think this is especially relevant in the Caribbean, where one of the characteristics is small scale. Even the largest economies are small. This means that the amount of endogenous research and development at the frontiers of knowledge is inevitably limited, simply due to considerations of scale. And that means that it's more important than ever for small economies to successfully tap into things that have been developed elsewhere and absorb them and use them. Again, something that we can discuss, but that would be my take on smaller, relatively isolated economies. Fourth point that I want to make is that rapid growth is not a miracle. We always talk about Chinese miracles, Asian miracles, East Asian miracles. And I think that's a mistake. Rapid growth is normal if the conditions are right. This is, in a way, an optimistic perspective, because it's not so easy to get the conditions right, and many countries do not. But if the country has developed sufficient absorptive capacity to really rapidly absorb global technology, then these 10% growth rates that are characteristic of China and were characteristic of Japan in the past, or Korea, or Taiwan, or Singapore, that's what is to be expected. So if growth breaks out, if you really get a sustained growth spurt, it will be very rapid. That will be normal. Of course, it's not so easy to get the conditions right. Next point, that rapid changes in technology can create new opportunities for emerging economies and developing countries. Because sometimes lead countries are locked into obsolete technologies, while the famous example is the takeoff of mobile telephones in Africa at the moment. It's the most rapid expansion of new technology anywhere in the world, in a country which completely lacks the old infrastructure for fixed telephone connections, which was hopelessly inadequate. But as they had not invested in the previous technology, the new technology is taking over rapidly. And there are many examples of that kind which we can mention. Next, and this will be no surprise to this region, multinational enterprises are key players in international technology flows. In the past, there was the idea, especially put forward by countries such as Japan and Korea, that you can keep multinationals at arm's length and that you can find other ways of accessing their knowledge through licensing, through manufacturing things that are actually designed elsewhere. But it seems that that option is no longer available, that the control of technology is so much in the hands of a rather limited set of very large multinational companies that we will have to live with the fact. And then the question is not whether or not you want to go for FDI, but how to optimize the benefits for the host country of having foreign direct investment. And there's a lot of leeway for policy to create the right kind of linkages and spillovers that you could have from foreign investment. So, the most important role of technology and innovation policy in emerging economies and developing countries is to foster the absorptive capacities at all levels of the economy, for individuals, firms, sectors, and the national economy as well. And the absorptive capacity, the ability to tap into global technology flows, is one of the conditions for accelerated growth. The idea of productivity as the core concept in development is not well accepted. Nowadays, especially if we talk about things like Millennium Development Goals, the tendency is to dilute development to include all good things in life, which I'm not against, of course. And I actually think that in some ways Millennium Development Goals have been quite successful, setting targets. But the problem with these MDGs is there's no theory behind them. It's just a list of desirables. And what we need to do is say, well, in order to achieve in the long term various goals, as increased welfare, reduced poverty, better health, better education, you need to improve productive capacity, which is ultimately the source that finances it, unless you want to be dependent on outside financing forever, which to some extent many economies in the Caribbean are indeed very aid dependent. They are extremely successful in maximizing aid flows, and some of the countries have the highest aid per capita in the world, partly through very effective foreign policy. Someone is actually doing a PhD on this at UNU-MERIT. But anyway, in the long run, at some stage, you want to reduce your dependence on that kind of flows, and that means increasing productive capacity. And there's a simple equation. Here you see a very simple equation, which is GDP per capita, which is the product of three terms. Your productivity per hour worked, the number of hours worked per worker per year, and the labor market participation, the percentage of the population that is working. It's a very simple but very telling little equation, because you can see that if you increase your labor market participation, other things equal, you will have higher GDP per capita. But nothing changes in your productivity. If you increase hours worked, and there's a lot of leeway for doing that. For instance, the Koreans work much more than the Dutch. Dutch are the laziest people in the world. They work 1,300 hours a year. The Koreans work between 2,400 and 2,600 hours a year. I don't know what it is in the Caribbean, whether you're lazy or energetic. You'll tell me. But there's a lot of leeway in increasing hours worked, and it's a big debate in economic reforms. Then, of course, you come to the most important thing, because there are limits to how hard you can work, there's limits to labor market participation, but the GDP per hour worked, that's where all the factors that determine productivity, including innovation and technology, that's where you sort of have possibilities of really extending far in the future. So this is why, to me, productivity is a key concept. It determines competitiveness. It is enough indicator of technological capabilities, though not always, because, for instance, if your productivity is completely dominated by oil in the short run, it may mask other weaknesses of an economy. So, again, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And also, I believe that productive capacity gives the society the fiscal capacity to invest in other desirable social outcomes, such as health, such as education, such as environment, etc. I'm going to skip this because I'll come back to it. And I believe that the central goal of all technology and innovation policy should be increasing the technological and economic dynamism of the economy. Okay, now I'm going to show you some slides with some stories about the mystery of development. Here you see, I don't know if you can see it from this side, GDP per capita in 1999, purchasing power apparently from the so-called Madison database. And it's a fascinating story, because in 1950, all countries are bunched together, and the differences in per capita income between, let's say, Ghana and Korea, actually Ghana was richer than Korea in 1950. And what you see is that as time passes, over the past 60 years, some countries, and I take Korea as the example, explode, and in 2 generations, from a very poor economy, become a high-income economy. Others, like Tanzania and Ghana, remain stuck, more or less where they are, after 60 years. And others, like Malaysia and Thailand, are in the middle. So, the mystery of development, and I think of innovation, is that what makes one country, starting from very similar bad conditions, explode, and other countries stay where they are. And again, I have some slides on religion as well. Here you have another little mystery. You have 2 countries, well-known countries, oil exporters. One, the bottom line, is Nigeria. The top line is Indonesia. We have this debate about whether natural resources are a curse or a blessing. Well, it depends on policy. Indonesia was able to reinvest its oil resources into manufacturing, exports, and become less dependent on oil export. Nigeria was not. But I think this is a relevant story for us. How can you use this fantastic resource for structural diversification? So again, I'd like to give you this comparison to show you what is possible. And knowing what is possible, I think, is an inspiration for policymakers. Here, this is a little bit confusing figure, but it shows how the Latin American economies, which started at much higher levels of development in 1950, much higher. Let's take Argentina, and here you have the Asian economies such as China. Well, look what happened to China, which is now at the level of Brazil. So that is catch up within the emerging world. And what you actually see is that since the 1980s, most Latin American economies sort of had very volatile growth, especially in the 80s, and only in the latest period, well, again, excluding the last years of the crisis, you have a resumption of growth. So here you see the changing pattern in the long run of rising Asia. India also, but India, which was at exactly the same level as China in 1978, somehow missed out and now has half the GDP per capita of China. So even in a short time of 78 to now, you see such differences which we need to understand and look at the policy sources. This is an example of a technology base. This is labor productivity per worker, always compared to the US, since 1960 for selected countries. Okay? Now look at China. Your point. China has a horizontal line up to around 1991, from 1980. What does a horizontal line mean? That it's staying in the same place relative to the US as the productivity leader, which means it's doing quite well, because US productivity is growing at 2-3% per year. So if you stay in place, you're having a respectable productivity growth. And then, after this long period of foundations, you get a sudden explosion of catch-up, moving from, don't be scared, from 5% of the US to 20% in 10 years. But those of you who think that China is going to be a world leader tomorrow are in for a big disappointment. Anyone disappointed? Look at the productivity gap between the US per worker and China. It is still in the order of 75-80%. So China is huge in size, but is still really a very much emerging economy in terms of productivity. So this is one of the surprising insights. If you read the newspapers, you know, China is going to be world leader tomorrow. It may well be in some 30 years if it can maintain its dynamics, but it's definitely not there yet in terms of productive capabilities. That's what comes out of these comparative statistics, full of it, if they're correct. So, that, again, I could say much more about it, but it's a very valid observation that you often see a period. You also see it in India, and you see it, well, a slow acceleration in the beginning in Taiwan and Korea, followed by a more rapid acceleration. And I've seen that pattern over and over again. Look at Brazil. Somewhere in the 70s, at 70% of the US level, down to 25% now. And I've checked this over and over again with my Brazilian friends, and it's really confirmed by, so they had, prior to the present wave of globalization, up to 1980, they had a very productive manufacturing sector. And somehow, it was not a sustainable one. It was so much built on an inward-looking protectionist mode of thinking that when they were forced to open up by the 1982 debt crisis, when the international organizations stepped in and imposed a lot of liberal reforms, but at that time they were probably inevitable, their manufacturing sector was simply not sustainable in the face of global competition. And that is exactly the more complex things that we need to think about. The same mistakes have been made in the Caribbean, by the way. They disregarded Arthur Lewis's advice and followed a protectionist regime in the post-war period, much as in Latin America. That will be the lecture that I'm giving tomorrow, but not here. Well, we'll see. So, very good point. You can sometimes have a high level of productivity which turns out not to be sustainable when you're really exposed to global competition. And again, the comparison with China and Asia is very interesting, because all these countries also had a phase of inward-looking nurturing of their manufacturing. But surprisingly enough, when China, when India actually started liberalization, many of their firms were able to survive, not all of them, but sufficient in order to keep on growing dynamically. And in most Latin American countries, it did not happen. So this, thank you for pointing this out. I'm going to, well, let me show you a little bit, some graphs on the Caribbean in a comparative perspective. Well, this, you know, well, I used bits and pieces of information that I could get quickly. You have both very varying levels of development, and you have very different patterns of growth, with some very dynamic economies, others like Haiti stagnating at very low levels, or the Dominican Republic. You have some countries with great volatility, like in the case of the Bahamas. Most countries are now suffering deeply from the crisis. But here you see the most rapidly growing economy is Trinidad, which undoubtedly is an oil boom that is driving it. And here you see other countries which have much, well, actually almost no growth if you look at these Jamaica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Kitts. So you have the same kind of variation over time, both in growth and in levels of development. So it's not a homogeneous region at all, which creates a lot of problems for thinking in common terms in the region. Now, I'm going to not go slide for slide because then I'll never finish. I want to talk to you about a paradox. I hope you get the sense of this global race. Countries moving up, countries moving down. It's a race which has been going on since long in history, with changes in leadership, where the leadership was first in the Islamic world, around 700 to 1100, then shifting to China, then shifting gradually to Southern Europe, the Italian city-states, then moving up to the northwest of Europe to the Netherlands, then shifting in the 18th and 19th century to the UK, leadership being taken over by the US around 1890, till present, and now being challenged by newcomers such as China. But as I showed you, they are not yet there, and we don't know what will happen. It makes it fun. Okay, so there's a lot of volatility in leadership if you take a very long-term perspective. People tend to take the international order as something given, and well, the US is there to say it isn't. There will be inevitably some change of leadership as time passes, as we've seen in history. If you look behind the frontier, you also see a lot of change. You see catch-up in the 19th century. Japan, Germany, those are Russia, were the famous latecomers in that time. Then if you take the 1950s, you get in the second half of the 20th century, you get the Asian tigers. Now you have the second wave of countries like Thailand, like Malaysia, like Indonesia. So there's a lot of movement. And some countries move from the bottom to the top in the space of when your grandchildren are alive. That very short time span. But other countries, like Argentina, which was the hope of the world in 1940, and actually due to sustained catastrophic policy making, they destroyed their promise and are still an emerging economy as we speak today and still struggling. But in the 1940s, people thought of Argentina as China. Now that was the shining example. Latin America actually has had a long period of rapid growth and catch-up from 1900 to around 1980, but then this change of the lost decade interrupted, and it became sort of falling behind relative to the Asian part of the world. So you get a feeling of tremendous flexibility in the world order. Some regions, well, I don't even want to talk about the Soviet Union, where GDP, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, plummeted to 1/3 of its level. Can you imagine 1/3? Before recovering after 15 years. Okay, So now we come to a global paradox. The world is becoming more unequal, whatever measure you take. I collect some statistics, but I mean it's 15 times as unequal as around 1820. The gap between the richest and the poorest is exploding. But in spite of the increasing global inequality between countries, the speed with which successful countries can move from the bottom of the ladder to the top is accelerating. It is much more rapid than in the 19th century. And this has to do with the globalization of knowledge and the possibilities of tapping into global technology. The opportunities for very rapid change of your position are there, but if they're not picked up, then you get either staying in the same place or falling behind in the global technology race. But it's, to me, a paradox. If inequality is increasing, it should become more difficult to move up the ladder. But the speed with which, and again, I have too many statistics, you can look at the slides later for those who are interested. But look at the thing of Korea, look at Taiwan, look at Singapore, moving from nothing to high income in a very short time. And again, Trinidad itself also has now reached high income status, though, again, based too much on natural resources. So then the challenge is to diversify before it runs out. Okay, so this is, to me, the first part of the lecture. Technology is supremely important because it really determines which countries will move up very rapidly, which will stay in the same place, and which will fall behind. So as a framework for what you are interested in, it will not tell you exactly how to do it and what to do, but the extreme importance of what the enterprise you're engaged in, that is the point that I'm trying to make. Yeah. Now, I want to spend a little time on your question that things are not simple. And I have a framework which says exactly the same. And you can look at growth and development at 4 levels. You can look at it as an economist who has a production function in mind, where you look at how a society accumulates capital, how it increases its labor supply, or educates its labor, how it exploits its natural resources, and the exponent E is the efficiency with which it does that. And efficiency is determined by many things, but especially by technology and knowledge. Having more knowledge makes it possible to exploit a given amount of human and physical resources more effectively. This translates into economic growth and productivity, which can then be invested in health, education, consumption, welfare, fair income distribution, reducing poverty, and environmental sustainability. But this arrow is not automatic, because a given level of growth or productivity does not automatically translate into a reduction of poverty. So you also need policy influences which directly influence how the fruits of economic growth are redistributed or invested. So it's an interaction between productive capacity and the level which I call the intermediate level of economic innovation and social policies, and also trends in terms of trade and demand. These sort of interact with the proximate sources to produce the final outcomes which we measure in the Millennium Development Goals. But policy, and this I think is a very important thing to emphasize for policymakers, is not something that you design on a drawing board. Well, you can do it. It never works out the way you expect it to do, because policies are constrained by the wider historical and institutional structure of a society. And you have very clear limits to the freedom of policy space, both in design and implementation. And this is where ultimate sources of growth and development come in, which are discussed in a lot of interesting literature, of which most of you must have heard. People like Achimoglu at the moment is very prominent. And you have things like geographic conditions, which are hugely important in the Caribbean due to the small island characteristics of small island economies, which create special challenges for absorptive capacity, for communication, etc. I think people are aware of that. Demographic characteristics, institutions which provide the incentives, but also the constraints within which you can make policy, cultural traditions, attitudes, also hugely important. For instance, attitudes towards saving and investment differ fundamentally between regions of the world. And these are culturally embedded attitudes which change only very slowly. I don't say they're unchangeable, but slowly. Long-run developments in science and technology, which show the science of the possible. You can't apply something which is not there. So, in a way, the frontiers of knowledge also create the opportunities for technological change. And very important, use this, the distance to the technological frontier. If you're far away from the technological frontier, you have opportunities of accelerated growth, because there's such a backlog of knowledge which is there to be absorbed. That's not negative, that's positive. Unless the gap is too large, so that you can't bridge the gap, and the absorptive capacities, which I will switch to shortly, are underdeveloped, so that you cannot profit from what is out there to be absorbed. Now move to technology. On this slide, you have a whole list of the common factors that affect at proximal level economic development. Riches, labor supply, theft, colonial drain, savings, capital, education, the various kinds of efficiency, specialization, scale economies, which is difficult in small island economies, structural change, which is interesting. I have a slide where most of the Caribbean economies are service economies, but with great variation. We might jump back to that slide. Better utilization of existing capacity, efficient choice of capital labor, proportions, organizational efficiency. These are all the different types of efficiency. But the most important in all theories factor affecting the long-run pattern of whether you stay here or move up is disembodied technological change. Developing or acquiring new knowledge about how to produce valued goods and services and applying such knowledge in production. Going back to Fred, such knowledge doesn't have to be new to the world. It can be new to the market or the country, or only new to the firm. All these kinds are different versions of technological change, either at the frontier or, which is much more important for emerging economies, absorbing things which exist out there and adapting them to local conditions. I want to go back, why doesn't it respond, to the structure of Caribbean economies, because that, check me if this is very incorrect. It comes from a paper from CARICOM plus World Development Indicators. And you see some very, to me, interesting patterns. First of all, the importance of services, but not in all economies. On average, it's about 70%, but Trinidad is much less. Trinidad has the especially high share, and you say it's even higher. But I took this figure from the CARICOM report, so you have to check with your colleagues why they got it wrong. This is a figure for 2008, so perhaps that could it change so much in 3 years? No. So I'll show you the figure. But this is the exception of such such strong dependence on mining, manufacturing is surprisingly unimportant. So it may be, well, this is a big debate where I don't know the answer, whether the future of innovation policy should be in upgrading manufacturing or focusing on innovation and services. You don't always need radical reform. What Roderick shows is that both in China and in India, rather small changes in the 80s and 90s had large consequences. So tackling some specific bottleneck can unleash forces which then become self-sustaining. And it is finding the specific bottleneck. For instance, if the returns to investment in a country, I mean that's an example he gives, are weak, it's no use acquiring more foreign finance. That's not the bottleneck. Finance is not, in the past we used to think of the financial requirements. How much money do we need? No, if the productive environment is, well, if the returns to investment are very low, money is not the problem. It is the lack of productive investment that's the key bottleneck. Once you have rapid growth, this is a window of opportunity for more fundamental reforms. Because to sustain growth in the long run, you will need fundamental reforms.